I am a humble fan who enjoys a myriad of things. One of the things I enjoy more than most is Devil May Cry. I have been blessed to be able to play every game in the series multiple times. As a massive fan, I'm sure you can imagine how hard it is for me to express how much this show has absolutely disappointed me, and in some ways brought about a great anger in me. But I will try my best to calmly explain and give valid reasons as to why this show is a complete disrespect to the series. However, I want to preface everything I'm about to talk about by first saying that despite what a previous short I made might suggest, I did not hate watch this show. If you saw any of my other videos on Devil May Cry, then you'll know that this is my favorite video game series of all time. So please understand that all my criticisms for this show come from me really wanting the show to be good and being horribly let down by it. With that said, I think it's only right that we start with the positives to give this thing a fair chance before I absolutely lay into it. To be honest, a lot of these positives are basically the same positives I have for the first season. I thought the soundtrack, for example, was actually pretty good, with the exception of some songs being a little overt, like Bodies from Drowning Pool, or some of them not really fitting the character or moments they were used for. The biggest problem with the soundtrack in this series is honestly the licensed music, and the music they keep pulling from the games. The original soundtrack for this series, as well as the remixes they made for it, are actually not that bad, and if they just stuck to those, it would be perfectly fine, but they keep trying to shove in these licensed songs, as well as the songs from the original series, into areas where they don't really fit or belong at all. And yeah, while the original soundtrack for this series isn't exactly what you would call classic Devil May Cry, I think it actually fits it surprisingly well. In the same vein that Noisia and Combi Christ fit the reboot surprisingly well, despite the fact that it is not what you would call traditional Devil May Cry. Second positive, the references. Again, much like my video on the first season, this is a positive and a negative. I actually appreciated a lot of the references to different characters, moments, and memes from the series. This one actually got a laugh out of me. It was a lot like how the games constantly reference themselves. However, when the games do it, you can tell the series is paying homage to itself. The references in the games are subtle but noticeable nods to moments and things from previous games that made the series what it is today. All the references in the show felt hollow, like it was just saying, hey, look at this character from the games, you remember them, right? This moment in the games was pretty cool, wasn't it? Check it out, we know DMC memes too, aren't they funny? This is probably because a lot of the references have little to no meaning or importance in the show. The keywords I used for the references in the games were subtle but noticeable. If you played the previous games, then you'll recognize them, but normally they weren't too intrusive, and anytime they referenced something larger, it was normally story relevant, therefore it held narrative weight and meaning. The show, on the other hand, will take major bosses, meaningful quotes, and like I said, character-specific songs, and just toss them in there with seemingly no care for how or why they were used in the games. These references end up being misused and feel empty if you don't understand why they happened or their significance in the games. But what can you expect when the whole series seems to have very little respect for the games? This last thing is purely a positive without any caveats. I thought Arius was a great villain. If this show can do nothing else, they at least seem to be able to make some pretty good villains, because along with the White Rabbit from the first season, they did a great job with Arius. He is the only stark improvement from the games. Not that the bar on improving him was very high to begin with, but whoever wrote him seemed determined to redeem him from his appearance in DMC 2, making him a properly manipulative villain with a thought-out plan, fleshed-out backstory, and proper motivations. He was a standout in almost the literal sense. He was written and portrayed in such a way that he felt like he didn't belong with any of the other characters he was on screen with, including Dante. Everyone else just felt like jokes while he was the only one taking everything seriously. My few complaints with him are that he's just kind of blatantly evil. Anyone in the show with any sense should have been able to pick up on that, and they didn't use Gloria. They showed Gloria in the first season as an Easter egg, so we know she's in this show, so I'm not sure why they didn't just bring her back as an actual character for this season, especially when they had Arius in this season with the demon clones of her. Okay, now that I've given this thing a fair chance and no one can accuse me of completely hating this show, I would like to succinctly break down all the things I think the show did right and wrong throughout the course of this season. Now, this might take a while, so just bear with me as I take the time to really just break down and explain everything that I thought this thing... Oh my gosh, this show fundamentally misunderstands everything about Devil May Cry. From the story, the characters, the themes, everything that makes Devil May Cry what it is, this show just straight up does not understand. Or maybe I should be more specific and say Adi Shankar does not understand any of that. And in order for me to properly explain my grievances with this show, I need you to understand that the story of Devil May Cry is incredibly character-driven. And to clarify what I mean by character-driven, I mean that the narrative within each of the stories within the series is incredibly dependent on the story, details, and dynamics of every major character within the games. So I mean this literally when I say this. Not only will the events of Devil May Cry not happen if you change the details of any of the characters within Devil May Cry, but you literally will not have the characters that are from the original series in anything that you make with them if you change details within their stories. Because the details, the specific details of their stories are literally what make them the characters that they are in the series. Some of you might be thinking that this isn't new, it started all the way back in the first season. And yes, you're correct, boy does that first season have a lot of problems, but I tried to give the first season a bit of leeway, it had a lot to introduce, and given all the deeper details and depth of the characters and story within Devil May Cry, I understood that there was a lot to introduce. And I understand that it's not always easy adapting something. Sometimes the details from one medium don't always translate well to another medium. As much as I'd like an adaptation to be as close as possible to whatever it's adapting, I understand that sometimes creative liberties need to be made, and I don't always expect an adaptation to be exactly perfect. I just want you to make the effort to try to get as close as possible. But that's my problem. Here we are in the second season, and I'd argue that they have actually gotten worse, and they have actively made efforts to get away and move further away from the thing that they're currently adapting. So with that said, yes, I am going to be that person who looks at the show from the perspective of it being an adaptation and who would like it to be an accurate adaptation of the thing that it is currently adapting. I'm going to go into detail to explain to you not only how the character dynamics, relationships, connections, and details of each character are important for portraying each character respectfully, but also show how if you get even the smallest aspects wrong, you can end up with completely different characters. For example, Dante in this show seems to have very little motivation to actually move forward in the story. And that's because realistically speaking, Dante has very little stake in any of the story going on because he has no connection to anybody that the story revolves around. He doesn't know who his father is, therefore he doesn't know who Mundus is, therefore he doesn't know who Argisax is, therefore he doesn't know who Arius is. The only person that he has any type of meaningful relationship with in this show is Virgil, and that honestly just boils down to, hey, I thought you were dead, I'd like to see you again, oh yeah, by the way, can you stop working for this random big bad guy who I think his name is Mundus. At some point, like midway through writing this season, I think they realized that Dante doesn't really have a lot that he's fighting for, so to fix that, they thought this was a good idea. Yes, of course. Instead of learning from the games and seeing how over time as both characters came to understand the tragedy of their lives and related to each other, reflected on their own lives and grew because of it, they thought it was a good idea to force them into a relationship without any character development and growth and then call that relationship character development and growth, despite the fact that that relationship doesn't even make sense within the confines of the actual show. Brilliant writing, truly. But we're just not going to focus on that right now because honestly, the more I think about it, the more it annoys me. Okay, I lied. We are going to talk about it a little bit more because the more I think about it, the more I realize just how much of an example this relationship is of how aloof and detached Dante is from almost everyone and everything that happens in this show. Dante's childish lack of care for everything going on around him means, one, he ends up getting dragged along for a good chunk of the plot. Dante has almost no agency in this season. Everything he does is at the behest of whatever the plot needs him to do or whatever this character within the plot needs him to do. Dante himself almost does nothing throughout this whole season on his own. Dante in the first season at least had the motivation of getting his amulet back, which led him down the rabbit hole, joke not intended, of meeting Darkcom, meeting Lady, meeting the White Rabbit, having to fight all of his demons, and eventually coming to one final battle with the White Rabbit at the end. Secondly, it makes it hard for me to take him seriously if Dante just goes along with everything that happens to him and has no reaction to it. He's just happy-go-lucky constantly doing whatever he wants, joking around and acting like nothing around him is ever serious. And to be extra clear when I say all this stuff, it's not that Dante doesn't show any emotion at all outside of being a goofball. In fact, I'd argue that Dante shows a bit too much emotion in the show, and it takes away from the subtlety and nuance the audience can pull from his character. It's that Dante acts like a genuine child sometimes. I know the show was playing this part off as a joke, but if this is actually how Dante sees things and his relationship with Lady, then it just proves my point that Dante is childishly naive in this show. And it honestly gets annoying to see after a certain point, because it's not a matter of him just being a carefree type of character who doesn't let anything get to him. It's that he's genuinely either too stupid to see the problem, or he's too naive to know that there is a problem. I'm also aware that Dante does know Mundus. I misspoke when I said that, and I will continue to misspeak about that throughout this entire video. But what I mean when I say that is that throughout the entire first season and up until the second episode of the second season, you would have no idea that Dante knew anything about Mundus, because we never see him even mention Mundus. And even after that point, further into the season, Dante speaks as if he doesn't know a lot about Mundus, or again, Sparda. And he only has a couple direct interactions with Mundus until the very last episode. And obviously Dante from the games also does this, hiding a lot of his emotional pain behind his bombastic, cool attitude. But the difference is that the games don't outright tell us that. We see in occasional cracks and breaks of that mask how Dante truly feels inside, the deep pain and oftentimes depression he has over the loss of his family and the tragedies he's had in his life. But those cracks and breaks are meant to be a fleeting contrast that give us a hint as to what he truly feels inside. The more important issue is that Dante has very little connection to two of the most important characters in the entire series, being Sparda and Mundus, which bleeds into another problem. I don't know why, but this show seems to insist on diminishing Sparda's importance and role within this series. I should have figured this out from the first season, given how they decided to completely diminish the absolute importance of Sparda's rebellion against Mundus. But that continues on in this season. Now, I understand one of the things they were trying to emphasize was Ava's importance in their lives, and to the show's credit, I do appreciate that it gave a little bit more time and detail to both Dante and Virgil's childhood and Eva's role within it. But it came at the detriment of Sparda, to the point where it's not that they neglected Sparda's importance in the show, it's that they outright diminished it. Like they put Sparda down in order to rise up Ava, which, again, not to say that she's not important, but she's important because of Sparda. Sparda already had a name for himself, being the strongest member of Mundus's army. In any other circumstance, Eva, I've probably said that wrong multiple times at this point, we're gonna stick with Eva. In any other circumstance, Eva would be just a regular human woman on Earth. But somehow, the humanity and love of this woman was able to turn and cause one of the strongest demons in the underworld to rebel against his master and seal it away forever, showing that her humanity and love is meant to be a stark contrast to the demonic nature of Sparda. And that dichotomy is condensed down even further into Dante and Virgil, as they both hold the natures of both Eva and Sparda. Yet instead of both natures complementing each other, like for Sparda and Eva, for Dante and Virgil it causes conflict and strife between the two of them, as they both hold completely different convictions as to what the demonic power of Sparda was used for, as well as the effect of the humanity and love Eva had on the one who wielded it. And that conflict is one of the defining themes of the entire series. So long story short, the humanity of Eva that is found in both Dante and Virgil is highlighted by the demonic half of Sparda. You cannot rise one above the other without canceling out an important integral part of both Dante and Virgil and the relationship between the two of them, as well as the relationship between Sparda and Eva. Mundus is perhaps the second most pivotal character in the entire series, given that it's because of the revenge he sought against Sparda that Dante and Virgil ended up the way that they are, and they ended up losing their mother. I don't think I really need to rehash the story that we all know of Mundus sending demons to kill Sparda's family. That incident alone kind of speaks for itself on how important Mundus is to the entire series. Or at least you think it would. But apparently this show thought it would be a good idea if the main character had no knowledge of or connection to the one being that created the most defining moment in their entire life. Though it's not like he would really recognize him anyway, given that Mundus, just like every other character in this show, is a complete far cry from what he is in the game. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, we only see him in one game, and in that game, he is really not much of anything but just evil. And to your credit, yes, that's exactly what he is. And that's the point. He's supposed to be the end-game boss, the ultimate evil of the game that is meant to be overcome by the hero of the story, Dante. And through him beating him by the end of the game, he not only overcomes the big bad of the game, but also overcomes the great evil that has caused a great tragedy within his life and within his family. Now the show tries to expand on him and give him a bit more of a personality than just big bad demon lord, which I don't inherently have a problem with. There's nothing wrong with wanting to add a little bit more personality to what is a pretty basic character. But if you are going to expand on a character, you have to remember and stay true to what and who that character is. And that's where the show fails, because in their attempt to expand on him, they ruined his character by making him almost sympathetic. Not only did they have Mundus as a lackey for Argisax, who basically betrays him for being too evil, instead of, being the second Lord of Hell in the original story, which I don't understand why they saw a reason to change for the sake of the story in this show, but they also almost made him like a nurturing father figure for Virgil, which is its own pack of worms that we'll be unpacking in a moment, just you wait. But here we go again with the sympathetic demons. Because Mundus is not an absolute evil, it puts into question everything he does in this show. He betrays Argisax for basically being too evil and making the underworld a terrible place, then takes over as ruler of the underworld and proceeds to make the underworld a terrible place, and then has the nerve to claim, "I need unity amongst all the sons of the underworld." What? Like, I genuinely don't understand his goals in this show. His unity involves making the underworld an inhospitable place even for other demons, enslaving and terrorizing other demons, and letting them run amok and kill each other. Again, what? None of this hypocrisy is called out. This is honestly starting to seem eerily similar to another character from this show. And before you say it, Sparda didn't betray Mundus because of that hypocrisy. No. He betrayed Mundus because he thought he was becoming too paranoid and forceful with his conquest for order within the underworld and human realm. And I get it, he's the big bad evil guy. He's not supposed to be trusted. But you cannot portray a character, evil or not, as sympathetic without calling out the hypocrisy of his actions or showing his actions to be genuinely truly evil by the end without people questioning the purpose of everything that he does. I'm hoping at this point that you may be seeing how important even the smallest character details and relationships are in character-driven stories like Devil May Cry. And maybe, just maybe, you might be seeing why so many people have taken issue with the Netflix series changing, taking out, or outright throwing shade at some of the most fundamental character details of the original series. But just in case you still don't get it, allow me to present you with perhaps the most prominent example I can give. Virgil. One of the cornerstones of the whole series, the foil and rival to our main protagonist Dante, and a character who I'd say is just as important as him as well. A villain whose motivation of gaining more power by any means so that he's never left to feel alone and powerless ever again stands in direct opposition to Dante's convictions to honor the power that he's been gifted through his bloodline by using it to protect those that power once protected before, with both motivations and convictions stemming from the same deep emotional trauma that they both experienced. Why did I just give you a small summary of who Virgil is and what he stands for? Because it's important to know in order for you to understand how changing one small detail in Virgil's story can change the absolute nature of who he is. Instead of being the dark, stoic loner that we know him as in the games, Virgil in this show is willingly subservient to Mundus. And in being subservient to Mundus, he is taught, nurtured, and one might say groomed by Mundus, even being given Yamato by him. Mundus teaches him how to fight, how to use his demonic powers, and instills in him the lesson that power trumps all and might controls everything. If you're keeping up, I've already mentioned several things that are glowing neon red right now, but I'll keep going. This means that everything Virgil knows, all the skills he has, and all the standards and principles that he lives by were taught to him by Mundus. Hey, so go ahead and raise your hand if you have no idea how to write Virgil and you had no plans on respecting him when you decided to actually start writing him. Just one hand? Okay, cool. Alright, then allow me to explain. Virgil's obsession with power is a conviction that he comes to on his own. When the demons attacked his family, Virgil had to fend them off by himself, nearly dying in the process because he thought his family left him. It was after that Virgil came to the conclusion that there was no one to save him and there will never be anyone to save him. And if what he believed was true, then that would mean that there was no one to protect him but himself. Therefore, he would need as much strength and as much power as he could possibly obtain. Virgil, realistically speaking, has a massive inferiority complex, but he shoves that inferiority deep down under all that cold stoicism and the lust for power, because he never wants that inferiority to show itself ever again, because he believes it is that inferiority that allowed his family to be attacked, allowed him to nearly die, and what made him have to defend himself in the first place. So not only would Virgil find it incredibly insulting for someone to try to teach him what power means and how to utilize it, but it also takes away from the absolute agency of Virgil. Virgil is a character who believes in his strength and his strength alone. It is his strength that allows him to do everything that he wants and needs to do. That's why he seeks more power, so that he will always be able to do the things he needs to do and protect himself at all times and never be left to feel below or lesser than someone. Him willingly following Mundus also, once again, undermines the importance of Sparda's role in his life. Yamato and Rebellion were keepsakes given to both Dante and Virgil by Sparda. They're as cherished and important keepsakes to them as the necklaces Eva gave them. It's in fact the only reason why Virgil survived that night. So with Mundus being the one to give Yamato to Virgil instead of Sparda, it ruins the lasting fatherly love that Sparda had for him, even though he wasn't there. Also, how did Dante have Rebellion, but Virgil didn't have Yamato? And on a slightly smaller note, Virgil's willful service to Mundus also ruins the irony and trauma of Virgil, who is an incredibly independent and willful person, being turned into a silent puppet controlled by Mundus. At this point, I'd like to say that this series shows how getting one small detail wrong in one character can cause a domino effect that affects every other character that's connected to them. Which is true, and this show is an example of that. But this show has messed up so many small details that frankly we're past domino effect. We've created multiple avalanches. Case in point, with Dante not having much personal motivation outside of wanting to see his brother again, and Virgil's lust for power, the thing that drives everything he does, being kneecapped, it makes the moments where they clash feel pretty much meaningless. The opposing ideals and motivations they both vehemently stand for not only define who they are as characters, but also puts them in natural conflict with each other. That soul-driven conflict between them is literally the driving force behind everything that happens in this series. So by messing that up, they have once again missed the point of the entire series. They even had the nerve to have Virgil say his line from DMC 5 at the end.
That day, if our positions were switched, would our fates be different? Would I have your life and you mine?
As if this show did anything to warrant the dramatic self-reflection of a character who we have seen let one obsession not only control and ruin his life, but that of so many others. We need to have a conversation about adaptations. If you watched anybody else's videos on this show, then you've probably seen a lot of them mention how people will use the fact that this is an adaptation as a defense for the show not being very good or the characters not being like they are in the video games. And look, it being an adaptation is a discrepancy to take into consideration for the good of it and the bad. Because something being an adaptation can be the precise reason why it is bad. And to explain what I mean, I think we need to nail down exactly what an adaptation is. Because while most people generally know what an adaptation is, I think their definitions of it can be a bit different. I believe there are two different types of adaptations. There's the one-to-one adaptation, where the adaptation tries its best to follow and recreate the events, story, and characters from the original source material. Now, for obvious reasons, this isn't always possible, as adaptations are normally adapting something from a completely different form of media, so sometimes creative liberties need to be made in order for the source material to fit into the adapting form of media. But generally speaking, there's normally a concerted effort to stay true to the original source material, which is no doubt one of the hardest parts of making a one-to-one adaptation. Movies like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and The Hunger Games are good examples of this. The second one is the inspired adaptation. Normally, these adaptations don't try to follow one-to-one to the original source material. Instead, they normally take the story, character, and themes from the source material and try to make their own world and story based on them. Think of shows like Castlevania or The Boys, or movies like Sonic the Hedgehog. They often carry the spirit of the source material, but they don't exactly follow everything that happens within them. Now clearly this type has the most leeway between the two of them, as it doesn't hold the responsibility of following the source material as close as possible. However, I would also argue that this type also has a thinner line to balance on. It has to properly mix the details from the adapted world with the unique ideas from the created world. If you have too many adapted details but not enough unique ideas, it can make audiences feel like these well-known characters are put into a world that doesn't fit them. Meanwhile, if you don't have enough adapted details but too many unique ideas, it can leave audiences feeling as if there's not enough identity from the original source material to call it a good adaptation of it. Though something that the people who are making either type of adaptation should constantly be keeping in consideration are what kind of reverberating effects any changes they may make for the sake of their adaptation may have on the story, character, or themes of what they're trying to adapt, and if those changes cause them to drift too far from the source material. I want to say that was a pretty small but fair breakdown of the different types of adaptations out there. Now, having explained all that, where does that put the Netflix Devil May Cry series? Well, frankly, nowhere. Because this show doesn't fit anything of what I just described. It's not a one-to-one because despite what Adi Shankar really seems to want us to believe, anyone with eyeballs and knows anything about the original series will immediately be able to see that this show is nothing like the original series and is far from any type of faithful adaptation of it. And since this show is trying to be a faithful adaptation, it clearly can't be an inspired one, despite this show taking several liberties with the story, themes, and characters. So that leaves this show very confused and without any solid ground as an adaptation, because it can't seem to figure out what it wants to do with the thing that it's trying to adapt. You're just left with something that took the characters' names, some of the themes, parts of the story from the source material, threw it in a ball, mixed it up, proceeded to throw that bowl at the wall, and then called that resulting splatter on the wall a show. So there is no way anyone can use the excuse, oh well, it's supposed to be an adaptation, it's not meant to directly reflect the characters from the game. This show does not even know what it is trying to reflect. Now I feel like I should clarify that you don't have to dislike this show because of this or anything else I've mentioned in this video. You're free to like this show as much as you want for any reasons you may have. But let's just be entirely honest with ourselves here. This isn't a Devil May Cry show. This is a show that is using the names from the game to try to make its own story. And no, I don't mean in the sense of an inspired adaptation. I mean it is taking the material from the games and trying to make something entirely different. And I feel like we need to start calling out terrible adaptations like this, because it's one thing to just make a poor adaptation. You know, sometimes mistakes are made and you just get it wrong. But it's another thing entirely when the people making an adaptation make deliberate choices to change, take out, or ignore key details from the source material that make it what it is. And I feel like if we don't start calling out the people who do that, it lets those people feel like they can just take the things that we as fans love and would want to see prosper in another type of media and use them as a stepping stone or a stool to prop up the stories that they want to tell as a creator, rather than the stories that we as fans want to see properly reflected and respected in an adaptation. And I'm not saying that whoever's creating an adaptation has to cater to every whim of the fans, but it does need to be understood that the fans are about 70 to 80% of the audience for an adaptation. Part of the reason why a lot of adaptations are made, on the business side anyway, is because whatever the adaptation is being made for already has a built-in audience. They don't have to work to try to get people to watch whatever they're watching. They will most likely have people brought in from the original source over to the adaptation to see what it's like in this form of media. I figure it would be in most people's bets to entertain them the most to make sure you have a sustainable and stable audience. I said it once and I will say it again and I will keep saying it. If you are going to make an adaptation, you must respect the source material. Because one, without the source material, you would not have the current adaptation that you're making. And two, what is the point of making an adaptation if you weren't planning on respecting anything from the source material that you are adapting from? At that point, you are only using the source material just for the sake of the notoriety of its name. I would have more respect for this show if it wasn't an adaptation. In fact, I'm confident if this show stripped the Devil May Cry name and was just its own unique show, well, it probably wouldn't be nearly as popular, but it mainly wouldn't get nearly as much criticism. I know I certainly wouldn't dislike it as much. I would still have problems with it, as many of those problems are outside of it being an adaptation, but those problems would be aimed at it being a standalone project. I could simply judge it off of what I thought it did well and what it didn't. But because this thing insists on calling itself Devil May Cry, despite acting nothing like it, and the original series being right there for us to judge it off of, most of my, and I'm pretty sure a lot of other people's criticisms are on how poorly it adapted the source material. So you can keep watching and enjoying the show as much as you want, and Ada Shankar can keep trying his best to convince people that this is a respectful adaptation that honors the source material, but I will no longer be taking part. I've seen enough of this show to know that this will never be a good adaptation, so I'm simply going to write it off and toss it in the same bin as all the other shows that tried, well honestly I don't think this even tried, to be a good adaptation and failed miserably. My only regret is that this is probably going to be the only adaptation we get of DMC for a while. There are still several things that I did not go into in this video. The power consistency is abysmal. There are still politics in the show when they don't need to be there. I don't know why this character exists. There are several characters and bosses that are just laid to waste for no other reason but because, oh hey, by the way, we put them on screen for all of 5 seconds. And honestly, the list just keeps growing the more I think about and look at this show. I could have gone into detail about all of that and more, but I wanted this video to focus on why this show is such a bad adaptation. Because I've seen plenty of people talk about how bad this show is, and they do mix in the poorly adapted details of the show, but I haven't seen a lot of people talk about why those poorly adapted details are so important, or at least so important to get right. Why they're so integral if you want to even get close to recreating the characters of the adapted story that you're making. And how getting even the smallest details wrong can completely destroy the original character and have bleed out effects to every other character that's connected to them. I hope that I was able to articulate at least some of that, and that you might have at least some idea why so many people are kind of hating on this show, because in all honesty, I think a lot of the trash that the show is getting is kind of warranted. I honestly think this show is a complete insult to the original series, and I understand with me being a big Devil May Cry fan, I might be a bit biased, but I want to think that if I, as well as everyone else who's a major fan of this show, cannot call out the mistakes this show is making and critique it, then what are we doing? I don't want to sound arrogant or like I deserve something other people don't, but we the fans are the primary audience of this. If you're not looking to us for most of your positive or negative criticism, then who else are you expecting to get it from? I hope you're not expecting to get it from the non-fans, because not that they won't like it, but that source of criticism is either going to be a very ignorant source of criticism because they don't know the source material, or it's going to be a very fleeting source of criticism because they don't know the source material, therefore they don't have any attachment to the series. Am I being a bit obsessive? Maybe, but I want to think that it's not without cause. If you like this show, please inform me. What is it that you like about it? And if you're a fan of the original series who watched the show and liked it, please inform me. Why? I want to thank you all for taking the time out of your day to watch an obsessive man rant about a show on a streaming service and not get their fictional characters right. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video.